Hello, everyone. My name is Fadhila. I am a PhD candidate at UCLA Department of Education, and
my name is Alexa Barger. I'm a PhD student in French at UCLA.
Good morning, everyone. The title of our presentation is Rereading Muslim Female Scholars in Times of Change, Reflections on Mernissi and Djebar and Implications for Female Education and Empowerment in the Maghreb. So I'm going to start with an introduction to provide a little bit of background about the topic. So the emergence of global citizenship education as a new educational model dates back to the Global Education First initiative in 2012, in which the goal of fostering global citizenship was among the three essential priorities. The two other aims were to put every child in school and to improve the quality of learning. This objective was again tackled in Goal 4.7 in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations in 2016. In this respect, the role of education was expanded and arithmetic skills to include the novel goals of peace, gender equity, mutual respect, environmental protection. The UNESCO plays an important role in canonizing the field of global citizenship education, and the importance of creating gender equity in educational spaces is actually reflected in its emphasis in Goal 4 on quality of education, and also Goal 5 on gender equality. Okay. Interesting enough, according to Sustainable Development Goals, Target 4.7, as shown in the slide, which says, like, by 2030, ensure that all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. Gender equality, as we see here, is juxtaposed with the goal of fostering global citizenship and promoting sustainable development. Both are key to achieving sustainable futures. To set the background, now, how does sustainable development goal target 4.7 play out in the Maghrebi context, in Algeria in particular, and why is the context relevant to this discussion? So here I quote the Algerian sociologist Mernissi in her book The Eloquence of Silence, Algerian Women in Questions, when she states that nationalism is seen as the other side of the colonial coin. Therefore, to understand the experiences of Algerian women in the post-colonial period and the way it impacts their educational opportunities, it is important to take a look at their experiences in the pre-colonial and pre-Islamic period. First of all, the pre-Islamic Algeria witnessed the womanhood for one of the historical things that we can mention about, like, experience of women is the womanhood of Al-Kahina, was a Berber queen who led her people against the Arab conquest of North Africa in the 7th century. She became a symbol of free women. During the pre-colonial era, women used male European captives to help them to clean their homes, run errands, and care for animals, and also do other domestic stuff at home. And women didn't themselves before these captives and showed a great freedom when dealing with men in general. Moreover, there were variations from region to region about veiling and lifestyle. During the colonial period of Algeria, the imposed prostitution, especially in cities such as Boussaada, along with the French system, which is viewed as immoral and contradicts with Islamic values, created the phenomenon of veiling, which came to be used as a form of difference and resistance. During the decolonization period, during the Algerian National War, women actively participated in the War of Liberation. And here we can mention Zohra Drif, Bouhiret, Lalla Fatma Zoumer, Belbouli, among other martyrs and freedom fighters. That being said, the political independence could be viewed as a disadvantage for the Algerian woman. And here, the revolutionary model of the state used Arabization along with Islamization to change the social landscape of the country. So as a result, women are still treated less than men, and the stereotypical depiction of women's lack of agency and disempowerment became common sense. Now, by situating the contemporary narrative on Maghrebi women within the broader global discourse on gender equality on the one hand, and the post-colonial narrative on patriarchy as the norm on the other hand, how can literary studies help us understand Maghreb women experiences, and what are the implications of these literary studies for women's empowerment in the Maghreb?
And in order to answer that question from Fadhila, I want to provide the example of the writings and the life of Assia Djebar, who was born Fatima Zahra Himalayan in 1936. And so she was born in Chachel to a middle-class family of Chinois Amazigh background. Her father was an educator and worked in the French colonial system where she began her education. From ages 5 to 10, she was also enrolled in the Quranic school. But then was not able to continue those studies due to separation of boys and girls, and completed her secondary education partly in French schools in Algeria and then in what we call metropolitan France. She would also do her higher education there. And this would be around the time of the War of Independence. So when she returns in 1962 to Algeria, she attempts to begin her career as an educator of history and literature, but finds that Arabic has been instituted as the only language of education, which is very troubling because what we see in her writings and in her decision to work in France from that point forward is that language and gender are interconnected in her narrative of education. To that end, I think we can especially look at works like L'amour, la fantasia, or Fantasia, as we call it in English, because it is one designed to be kind of a comparative narrative of Algerian women's experiences from the colonial period to Assia Djebar's present day in the 1980s, but it begins with her childhood and the moment in which she was brought to the French colonial school. And I'll read this quote that describes her experience. From the very first day that a little girl leaves her home to learn the ABCs, the neighbors adopt that knowing look of those who in 10 or 15 years' time will be able to say, I told you so, while commiserating with a foolhardy father, for misfortune will inevitably befall them. And what we see here is this sense of scrutiny, of exclusion that Djebar experiences, and also these contradictions of being educated in a colonial system that one allows her a certain freedom in how she can dress and how she can move through certain spaces, but also doesn't allow her a greater connection with her faith and with her certain aspects of her culture. And so it's interesting when we compare this narrative with how she describes the Quranic school, and I quote directly, it's paradise regained for her because she's able to refamiliarize herself with calligraphy, with her faith, with aspects also of her mother's side of the story. But slowly she begins this education with a few girls, and then slowly she becomes the only girl. She was with other girls also of Amazigh background, then becoming the only girl, then eventually being excluded as a result of her gender. And so when she looks back at all this, she describes this kind of ambivalence and this kind of exilic relationship to language. And I read the quote, the language of the others, in which I was enveloped from childhood, the gift my father lovingly bestowed upon me, that language has adhered to me ever since. And that sense of adhering is kind of poisonous and painful, but at the same time, it's something that allows her a great amount of mobility in terms of her education. And this, I think, becomes quite clear when we look at the context provided by Lasveg and also by Fatima Mernissi when describing women's education. Whereas young girls, maybe in the 19th century of Djebar's background, would not have been able to hope for a transformation of their lives through education, they would have these moments later, and there's almost this kind of radical promise in having these combinations of experiences. And I'll read this quote from Lasveg. that women who were born in the 1930s, and many of these women who were also involved in the War of Independence, were the first generation who had attended French schools or Franco-Arab schools. And Algerian children who had happened to attend these kinds of schools were able to attend lycée and attain higher levels of education in the French system. So at the same time that they have this opportunity and are able to imagine a different future for their nation, they soon become excluded. And by the time Fatima Mernissi is writing in Islam and Democracy at the time of the Civil War in the 90s, they become targeted. And Mernissi just claims that the reason that these women continue to be targeted is simple. They're the only ones who publicly assert their right to self-affirmation as individuals, not just through words, but through actions, having succeeded in infiltrating one of the citadels which was long forbidden to women, formal education. So I think there's a certain level of resistance that women demonstrate by seeking this education. But I think when we look at Djebar, we also see how language and culture complicate this and make that sense of targeting even more acute. So this becomes more evident when we look at Algerian White or Le Blanc de l'Algérie, which is mainly focused on violence during the Civil War, and Djebar continuing to reflect on the post-colonial state. And she really condemns the educational system in its, quote, promoting the national language of Arabic by officially restricting the living space of the other languages. So she's talking about different dialects of Tamazight, she's talking about spoken forms of Arabic, and she's also looking at how French is being increasingly diminished, banishing a dialect that was vivid in its original iridescence and creating the denial of an entire people's genius, thereby connecting these matters of gender, language, and culture in the negation of the possibility for global citizenship and growth. So to counteract this, and Djebar is also kind of looking at this with a sense of complicity in having had opportunities that might not have been available to many girls, and also looking at kind of her cohort of fellow writers, she says there needs to be another way of looking at this. And I'll read the quote here, that perhaps it is time for the few writers, and I would also say educators occupied with questions of Algérianité, to tackle texts that they may feel constrained to write, no longer memory of a colonial past in which their childhood took place, and she's kind of holding herself accountable here, but in the light of present threats on the land of their ancestors, even if they have left it behind. So in that sense, she's proposing this image of a literary and also kind of a philosophical Algérianité as a counter action to this state-imposed mode of education that excludes individuals on the basis of culture, on linguistic basis, on questions of gender, such that we can continue to kind of foster these newer possibilities, ones that don't negate a people's genius, as she describes. So I think when we look at the GCEs that Fadhila described, we also have to recognize that attending quality education and gender equality requires a level of cultural and historical awareness that depends on the nation and the setting. But for Djebar, this is something that is impacted by many different factors: a colonial history, a multilingual family, experiences of artistic and intellectual exile. And I think when we look at her testimonies and we look at a broader body of literature, we can see how this kind of writing can be an assessment and a testimony of experiences of education. And I would also argue that educators need to continue to consider these accounts when engaging with these ideas of global education and global citizenship, because it's only by looking at this that it can be made possible. So I want to thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's it.